The end of World War I saw the collapse of the German Empire and the beginning of a tumultuous revolutionary period in modern German history. As the Kaiser abdicated, the Popular Social Democratic Party proclaimed the formation of a democratic republic in the town of Weimar on November 9, 1918. The new nation faced a variety of problems, including political instability, returning politically charged veterans with guns, revolutions from both the left and the right, and economic hardship as well. In spite of this environment, most German citizens were tolerant or even supportive of the new democratic republic, demonstrated by people protesting in the hundreds of thousands in the streets after the assassination of Alterrathnau by far-right paramilitaries in June of 1922. The Treaty of Versailles, the Allies imposed on a defeated Germany, placed restrictions on the size of the German military, forced Germany to give up its colonial possessions, and Alsace-Lorraine, and economic sanctions, chiefly reparations, would be some of the factors contributing to the infamous hyperinflation crisis beginning in 1922. This video will cover the causes of hyperinflation, the hyperinflation itself, and finally the aftermath and stabilization of the German currency. Although Weimar Germany only felt the effects of the hyperinflation crisis from 1922, the roots of the crisis go all the way back to the start of World War I. Unlike the governments of other major powers such as Britain and France, Germany's Kaiser Wilhelm II opted to instead pay for the war in loans rather than increase taxes on his citizens. The Kaiser believed that once Germany won, they could utilize the plunder from their victory to pay for the exorbitant loans they took out in order to fund their war machine. The Imperial Diet believed the war would be short, and financial mobilization had been geared around that belief, and any war debts would be paid off by reparations imposed on the vanquished Allied powers. Even as the illusion of a fast victory faded in 1914, Germany's finance ministers were still confident in a long, although inevitable, German victory. This was not the case, of course. By the war's end, not only was Germany defeated, but had accumulated a wartime debt of approximately 60 billion marks. This was further complicated by the imposition of the Versailles Treaty on Germany in 1919. Among many things, it crucially required Germany to pay reparations in the forms of 5,000 railway engines, 136,000 coaches, 24 million tons of coal, and 50 billion marks. German governments were caught in a trap between needing to increase taxes to fund peacetime expenditure and being attacked by the nationalist right for increasing taxes to fund the dictated Peace of Versailles. This, combined with the increased printing of notes during the war, began an inflationary spiral that only got worse as time went on. Inflationary pressures appeared controlled officially, but black market prices more accurately reflected the rising prices for typical household goods. Inflation continued to spiral, with $1 buying 1,000 marks in August of 1922, then 3,000 marks in October that year, and 7,000 in December. This meant that Germany became unable to meet its reparations payments, which were tendered in gold, and had been falling behind on its delivery of coal to the French. German coal miners were even forced to work extra shifts to produce more coal, at significant cost to their personal lives and health, but Germany was still not able to meet its requirements. In response, the French and Belgian armies sent troops to occupy the industrial region of the Ruhr in January 1923 to seize the missing coal. The German government encouraged passive resistance, telling workers not to assist the occupying forces in any way. German industrialists, on the other hand, began to contemplate working with the French to protect their wallets. This effectively became a general strike in the Ruhr, with workers not going to work in the factories. The economic situation only became worse as industrial output declined, and the Berlin government had to pay the wages for the striking workers. The combination of all these factors and the German central bank constantly printing money further worsened the inflationary spiral and created one of the worst inflation crises in modern history. In February of 1920, $1 could buy 100.5 marks. The currency valuation began to improve to 40.25 marks in June that year, but began to worsen towards the end of 1921. As the inflationary crisis worsened, a dollar costed 1,975 marks in August 1922 and over 7,000 in December. In January 1923, coinciding with the Franco-Belgian occupation of the Ruhr, a dollar costed 17,000 marks. By July, it costed 353,000 marks. Inflation was occurring at a truly staggering scale, and by December of 1923, $1 costed 4.2 trillion marks. Paper money became worthless during the crisis, and the printing presses used to produce the paper notes became overwhelmed by the demand. Workers began to collect their wages in wheelbarrows and would immediately head to the nearest shop to buy goods that they didn't need, which they would then use to barter. There were stories, whether true or not, of thieves robbing people with wheelbarrows filled with money, dumping the money, and then stealing the wheelbarrow. The barter trade grew exponentially during the crisis. As one student at the time, Willy Durkow, later recalled, "You very often bought things you did not need, but with those things you could start to barter. You went round and exchanged a pair of shoes for a shirt, or a pair of socks for a sack of potatoes, some cutlery or crockery, for instance, for tea or coffee or butter. And this process was repeated until you eventually ended up with the thing you actually wanted." One of the groups most badly affected by the crisis were those on fixed incomes. Retirees with investments, pensioners, or workers paid on a salary saw their savings and incomes become worthless. Some retirees were forced to enter the workforce just to keep their head above water. Workers, backed by trade unions, were better off initially, as unions would bargain so that wages kept pace with rising prices, but towards the latter end of the crisis, even these negotiations failed to keep pace with the rapidly depreciating currency. Very few individuals were better off. For example, individuals with mortgages were able to easily pay them off as their wages began to be paid in the millions and billions of marks, being able to acquire their properties for virtually nothing. Wealthy individuals were able to buy assets and property early in the crisis and pay off their investments only a few months later in their entirety. At the height of the crisis, 90% of spending for the average family was on food alone. Germany was grinding to a halt. Malnutrition became increasingly prevalent, businesses stopped paying their workers, and by September 1923, two-thirds of Berlin's trams stopped running. The path out of the crisis was not going to be easy. Germany was able to overcome the hyperinflation crisis through a series of astute political and economic maneuvers by the central government. The long-serving Foreign Minister Gustav Stresemann assumed the office of Chancellor in August 1923. Immediately, he embraced a policy of fulfillment, in contrast to the previous policy of resistance, where he promised the French to deliver their coal in exchange for their withdrawing of troops from the Ruhr region. Germany's promise to honor its reparations prompted the international community to re-evaluate Germany's financial burden and the implementation of the Dawes Plan designed by American finance expert Charles Dawes in 1924. The Dawes Plan set out a staggered payment plan for German reparations, which would have progressively increased installments every year, along with a loan of $200 million to revitalize the economy. Stresemann also appointed Hjalmar Schacht as the head of the Reichsbank on the 22nd of December 1933. The process of stabilizing the currency began in November, when a new currency called the Rentenmark was issued, tied to the price of gold. Schacht ensured that it was protected from speculation. It circulated for several months until it was eventually replaced with a new permanent currency, the Reichsmark, introduced on August 30th, 1924. In German society, the middle classes became fractured, with some being financially ruined whilst others were relatively well off, and the various groups had to confront one another. Crime swept the country as theft increased, and society broadly became more cynical. Anti-Semitism also seemed to rise, as many blamed the crisis on Jews and believed that those profiteering from the disaster, namely the black marketeers, were also Jewish. After the crisis, however, the Weimar Republic saw an era of relative prosperity, referred to as the Golden Years from 1925 to 1929. In this period, the German economy was prospering, reaching pre-war levels of output. German culture was thriving through films and art, and Berlin became the cultural capital of the Western world. Politically, Germany became welcomed back into the international community when they were invited to the League of Nations in 1926. The Young Plan, introduced in 1929, continued to stimulate economic prosperity, but that would all come to a sudden demise during the Great Depression, when the unstable foundations of the German economy through American loans would cause a collapse. The hyperinflation crisis also saw a moderate increase in the popularity of the Nazi Party, but nothing significant enough to fundamentally challenge the governing coalition. Through shrewd political and economic management, the German economy was able to recover strong from the currency crisis, and the following years of loans and economic stimulus helped the German economy perform well. At the same time, however, it shook many people's confidence in the Republican government and would help lay the foundations for other populist parties, like the Nazis, to gain more momentum and a larger voter base in the future. Thanks for watching.